Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teachers and in Spectacles. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the character of Mrs Birling and thinking about what she represents in and in Spectacles. So let's get started. So who is Mrs Birling and what does she represent in and in Spectacles? So Sybil Birling is the matriarch of the family. She is mother to Sheila and Eric, and she is quite a hard, controlling woman. Her involvement in Eva Smith's death is, of course, the fact that she ran the charity that Eva Smith appealed to for help while she was pregnant, and it was Mrs Birling and her influence that had her turned away. So in terms of what she stands for, she really is that symbol of class prejudice, particularly that middle upper class prejudice and the hypocrisy that people like Priestley were seeing in that kind of capitalist society. But she very much represents the female version of that capitalist middle upper hypocrisy. So let's start by looking at the first depiction of Sybil Birling. So in response to Mr. Birling, we get Mr. Birling's description first, and then it's his wife, which is fairly telling in itself. His wife is about 50, a rather cold woman, and her husband's social superior. So it's this adjective that I want to draw your attention to, because actually this description of her as cold is so fitting for all of the behaviours that you're going to see throughout the play. She's cold, she's unfeeling, she's emotionless. The fact that she's her husband's social superior is quite important. Mr. Birling, Arthur Birling, has made his money. He's that product of that rising middle class, whereas Mrs. Birling clearly came already from a higher class than him, and you can see that in her interactions with him. Mr. Birling blunders, he makes social mistakes, and she firmly corrects him. This is just from the very opening, where Birling says, "Tell cook from me that it was a lovely meal." Gerald politely says, "Absolutely first class," and Mrs. Birling reproachfully, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things." So those adverbs of manner tell us something. Gerald is being polite because he knows, as someone from one of the upper classes, that Birling has made a faux pas. You don't bring up the servants, and you certainly don't thank them at the table. And so when Mrs. Birling is reproachful, which means telling off, so she says it in a telling off tone, she's actually embarrassed in front of Gerald. So this is very much about keeping up appearances, presenting yourself the right way. And that is key to a lot of her future behaviours, and previous behaviours. Even the way that she says such things, so Priestley's deliberate use of vague language there means that she is stopping herself from even exposing what the blunder was. It's such things. It's rather reminiscent of the way that they refer to Eva's death as this business. It's distancing, it's moving itself away, even when it is something as little as a mistake about how you talk about your staff and your food, etc. She is also very clearly a product of the patriarchal structure that she has been brought up in. Look at the way that she advises her daughters on the issues of love. When Sheila, playfully but half seriously, sort of points out that she wasn't massively happy about the fact that Gerald didn't come near her for 6 weeks, Mrs. Birling says, "Now, Sheila, don't tease him." So straight off, you've got that kind of matriarchal control in this case. It's her, the mother, using imperatives, telling her what's right. When you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. So she's basically telling Sheila to suck it up. Yeah, just get on with it. And it is quite clear that that's the lesson her mother probably taught her. And it's certainly the way that she's lived her life. Do we feel sympathetic towards her? Maybe a little tiny bit, because is it her fault that she was born into this situation, into this privilege? It's just what she has learned. And there's also a little clue here that perhaps just as Gerald has been having affairs before they're even married, just as I had, perhaps she's had to get used to Mr. Birling having affairs too. But this idea of just accepting it and not looking any deeper is really, really interesting when you think about what her name is. So Sybil is actually the name of a prophetess from Greek mythology. So originally she was Sibylla. This is a little bit that I just snuck off Britannica for you here. Tradition represents her as a woman of prodigious old age, uttering predictions in ecstatic frenzy, always a figure of the mythical past, and her prophecies were handed down in writing. So a Sibyl, this is obviously referring to a specific Sibyl, Sibylla, in Greek mythology, but it means that the word Sibyl has come to mean prophet or prophetess. It pops up all over the place. In Shakespeare's Othello, for example, he talks about how his handkerchief was sewn by a Sibyl, a prophetess. So the fact that Sybil Birling's name means prophetess, which suggests someone who knows the future and knows the truth and can see things, is really painfully ironic. Not because she doesn't see things. I think it's because she does, but refuses to do anything about it. So when she says you'll have to get used to that just as I had, she is agreeing and conforming to this expectation that women will not complain even when their husbands are cheating. She knows what's going on, but she refuses to admit it. So she's sort of like the anti-prophetess, anti-knowledge. And that is across the board. It's not just her relationship with Mr. Birling. She refuses to see. This is in relation to Eric and the realization that Eric is the irresponsible young man that got Eva Smith pregnant. And she says, I don't believe it. Okay, fine, declarative. I don't believe it. That's her right. I won't believe it. So here we have a refusal to see the truth. She is refusing, which is why her name is wonderfully ironic. I said at the beginning she is a symbol of class prejudice and hypocrisy, and Priestley makes this very, very clear by the way she presents her attitudes, and the way that Priestley presents her attitudes towards Eva Smith. So in relation to Eva Smith's appeal for support from her charity, Mrs. Birling says she was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. So Priestley is demonstrating here that Mrs. Birling sees Eva Smith as less than human because of her class. Now, when I say less than human, I mean it's because she is suggesting that Eva Smith, as a lower class woman, doesn't have the right to morality, that she somehow wouldn't have the capacity to have the high, fine feelings and morals that someone of her class would, which is extraordinarily ironic because this is a moment of such painful immorality. If you want to look into the language, the idea that the adjective ridiculous, it's laughable to Mrs. Birling that Eva Smith might have morals. Simply absurd. Yeah, the adjective simply absurd. There's no doubt. And this verb here, she's claiming, that immediately suggests lies. And then we see her using her power in order to deny this young woman because she can't believe in her ability to have feelings and morals. Look at this where I have underlined it. So I used my influence to have it refused. I consider I did my duty. So again, we've got another level of irony here, because you might think to yourself, well, hang on a minute. Isn't the idea of a charity supporting young women in need about helping? And here is Mrs. Birling seeing a young woman in need and refusing to help and using her class and her influence to ensure that this woman didn't get help. And it's because the reason for being involved in a charity is not because of any altruistic desires to help mankind. It's about power and appearance. It's about what you seem to be doing. And in this moment, Mrs. Birling has been offended by a young woman that claimed her name. But it's not just about Priestley saying, oh, isn't Mrs. Birling awful? Aren't middle upper class women of the early 20th century dreadful? It's actually about making a comment to the audience about the current climate they're living in and helping them to make decisions that will be right for the rest of the world. Mrs. Birling's presentation by Priestley is actually highlighting the flaws in the system of the early 20th century so that Priestley can say, don't let this happen again. Yeah, instead, what you need to do is vote Labour, make sure that the welfare state is up and running, because this is the point. In 1912, there was no NHS, there was no welfare state, which is of course put into place in the mid-1940s, which is when Priestley was writing the play. So that meant that charitable actions for the poor were determined by the people that were predisposed to judge them and see them as inferior. If you actually look at what the inspector here and Eric are saying, Eric says to the inspector, she went to your mother's committee for help after she'd done with you. Your mother refused that help. So it is down to women like Sybil, who are already predisposed to judge the lower classes and see them as less than human, to determine what help they get. That is absolutely flawed. And most emotively, the inspector says, you refused her even the pitiable little bit of organised charity you had in your power to grant her. Now, yes, this is a criticism of her. You could have helped her, you chose not to, you refused to see. But actually note these adjectives, pitiable little. So there is an understanding that even the charity that she could have offered her actually may not have been that great. It would have been pitiable, it would have been little, it would have been something, but it wouldn't have solved the situation. Even if Mrs. Birling had been the loveliest, most charitable, most philanthropic person on the planet, she still probably wouldn't have been able to help her as much as she would need. I.e., Priestley is saying to his audience, look, Labour are for the welfare state. The welfare state will not be determined by the upper classes who are predisposed to judge the lower classes. They'll just see someone in need and help them. Vote Labour. That's what's going on here. So Mrs. Birling has a much bigger function. Having said that, she's also pretty interesting because of her total lack of character development. Normally when we're looking at characters, we expect some shifts and changes. Just want to show you a collection of quotations that I've just sort of like taken from bits of the play chronologically. So, first one we've already talked about. The first thing we learn is that she's a rather cold woman. And I'm going to put it to you that at no point in this play is she anything less than a rather cold woman. Unlike other characters, even Gerald seems to have a fleeting moment of remorse, doesn't he? He seems to actually have some moments where he is using his moral compass and thinking, you know, right or wrong. He just chooses wrong. But Mrs. Birling, cold all the way through. Look at this. Don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide. Girls of that class. Girls of that class. The suggestion is there is such a difference. What she's doing is she's making Eva Smith the other. Yeah, she's saying over there, she is the other. How are we to know what girls of that class would do? Bearing in mind, right, suicide considered quite a sin because you're taking the life that God gave you in his, you know, in his image, etc. So it's this distance. Oh no, we can't put ourselves in those people's shoes. No empathy. Look at the way she speaks to the inspector, name dropping, such a sign of her class and her sense of privilege. My husband was Lord Mayor only 2 years ago, and he's still a magistrate. Danger, danger. Mr. Birling does exactly the same thing. She also says that the inspector is peculiar and offensive because she is not used to people questioning her. I'm sorry, I think she had only herself to blame. That speaks for itself, doesn't it? And in this moment, this is after, right? So this is after she has found out everything, including the fact that her actions were the last in the tale. Yeah, she was the last person that dealt with Eva Smith. It's not the last story, as in Eric, because Eric has to tell the story afterwards. But in terms of the timeline of Eva Smith's life, she is the last person that had an influence, that had an impact. And even knowing that, I told him quite plainly that I thought I had done no more than my duty. It's smug. She's like, what? I didn't cave. I didn't admit to anything that I feel bad about now. And then lastly, right at the end, after the inspector's gone, they're overtired. In the morning, they'll be as amused as we are. Great declarative statement there, suggesting one, she knows her children's minds, it's putting words in their mouths in advance. It's the same view that we saw at the beginning of the play in response to Sheila. They're just overtired. These emotions that they're having, it's just a sign of a little bit too much excitement. So, no character development. So what's Priestley up to? Because Priestley is a damn good writer, so it's not a mistake, is it? You know, some people talk about Mrs Birling as being a bit of a 2D character, but I think that's the point. That's the point, is that he is positioning a type of person and saying, these people don't change. They won't change. So what do we have to do? We've got to change the systems so that they don't have the power. And on that bombshell, thank you so much for watching. I hope it was useful. If you've got any questions or any comments, or you want to disagree with me or whatever, pop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and then you'll get notifications of when more videos are coming for you for either your study of English literature or language. Thanks again. Happy revising.